This conversation is brought to you ad-free thanks to the generous support of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon community. To gain access to early release of all episodes, the full podcast archives, and other extras, visit patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness. Ike Baker, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. Great to meet you, man.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. We were speaking before we started recording about what we might talk about in this conversation. And I was telling you how, I guess, every once in a while I kind of do a deep dive into the zeitgeist, through what's coming up on YouTube and social media and things like that, just to see like what people, particularly younger people, are interested in terms of, the areas that I cover here: psychology, spirituality, esotericism, that kind of thing. And what I've been noticing is that there seems to be a heck of a lot of interest in Neo-Platonism, Western Esotericism, the Hellenic world. And so it seems like there's a lot of younger people who are interested in those ideas. And I hear a lot of scholars talking, and they're getting a lot of views on YouTube. But I'm not sure how many people are actually taking the step into practice. And so I thought you'd be a great person to have on, because I see you as someone who's really on the front lines as a scholar practitioner who's out there creating content about these topics, and also leading courses and speaking at conferences and that kind of thing. So you're really on the ground, and I think you probably have a really good perspective on what's happening here. And, is it some kind of new renaissance that we see happening, which I kind of have a suspicion that it might be. At least the seeds are there. Whether or not it will actually flourish into an actual renaissance is, remains to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the vote of confidence. I would say that, I am a little critical of some of this stuff. And so, some people may agree with me, some people may disagree with me, and that's totally fine. I'm not all for everyone agreeing all the time. I think we need a diversity of opinions. But what I'm seeing is that we're effectively in an existential crisis, and we have been in one since long before 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago. We have been, particularly, it's been a long time coming, especially for, I would say generations kind of coming into their own right now, coming into adulthood into complete disillusionment. It's been a long time coming, right? We were a far cry, the millennials, from our parents' generation, or even the generation that preceded us. We were probably more like Gen Xers, but a far cry from the generation that spawned us, for sure. And I don't want to get into generational politics, because I think a lot of that is bullshit. It's like meant to foment differences and like hyper sort of highlight differences. And I'm much more about taking those differences but bringing them together instead of having them rip us apart.
Yeah, I'm a bridge guy too.
Yeah.
And just for the record, I'm definitely Gen X. I was born in '74.
Mm-hmm.
I turned 16 in 1990, grunge era and all of that. I really identify with Gen X kind of apathy, disillusionment. And so actually, I resonate a lot with what I'm hearing from millennials and Gen Zers, who are really, right at the tail end of Western Civ.
Yeah. And the thing is, it worked for the Gen Xers. Why? Because their parents, for the most part, raised them in traditional households, and so they were still engaged somewhat with the social contract, they checked out and stuff like that. But I think that there was an underlying moral compass that had to do with what we might consider traditional sort of social courtesy and things of this nature. And granted, that's not necessarily true for the entirety of the generation. Nothing is true for the entirety of a population or a demographic. But what I see is that the apathy and the disillusionment that we see in millennials and really Gen Zers, they don't have the same root in sort of like a traditional childhood where it's, you hold the door for people and you say please and thank you, and it's just these baseline things that seem completely arbitrary and completely trivial, but at the end of the day, it's those little things that are holding fucking society together. Yeah. And Gen Zers had that. Whereas, Gen Xers, Gen Zers and stuff, we didn't have the same kind of upbringing. A lot of us were raised by single parents who were, not in the home very often. But anyway, I'm sure somebody could pick apart my argument. It's just what I've seen from my cousins, those people, my cousins, some of my younger aunts and uncles, they're Gen Xers. And it's like, yes, there's an apathy and there's a disillusionment or kind of like a cynicism is probably the best word. There's a general cynicism and distrust of authority, but at the end of the day, they still have heart. Whereas I see a lot of the Gen Zers kind of like, they don't have that root. So it's all apathy. It's all checking out. It's an extreme of that stuff instead of like this kind of affectation or develop this development, what I'm saying? So now look
that's
at
great. There's like real nihilism as compared to Gen X, like performative nihilism, where it's where it's an affect, right? Yeah. I hear you, man. That's such a good take. Yeah.
Well, it's just something that I've observed, like being in this medial position of the millennials, where it's like, yeah, okay, my boomer parents, they were not around very often because my mom had to work and she was a single parent. And like I hung out with my Gen X cousins and aunts and uncles, and then like I see the younger generation and I turn to them and I'm like, we missed a step here, this is a radical difference where it's like, okay, we're progressing from boomer, Gen X, millennial, and then you turn, it's like, it should be the next kind of anticipated leap in the sequence or whatever you want to look at it, step up, step down. And what it ended up being was like a fucking gulf. Like it's very, very different. They're very different. But I'm also approaching 40 now, so it might just be in like old man yells at cloud mode. But to get back to the question, I see us having for a long time now been in an existential crisis, a crisis that scholars like John Vervaeke have labeled as a crisis of meaning, certainly, but.
Well, I think Carl Jung was calling for that in 1950s and 60s. Modern man in search of a soul. So
yes, absolutely,
we're downstream of that.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's just I think the crisis was in its beginnings at that time, particularly the post-industrial era, right around World War I. I would say. That was a massive global traumatic event, and then followed quite shortly in the span, as far as history goes, by World War II. That was a massively traumatic event that I think we're still living in the trauma wake of. And I'm not using that in terms of like a psychology speak victimization language. There was serious, deep consequences from that massive sort of, worldwide conflagration. Now, and it's interesting because in those times, the magical orders, and there's always an uptick in magical activity right around the time of major, at least in the last, 100 years or so, maybe two, right? Because it also ticked up, particularly in France and with Freemasonry in America, right around the time of the American and French Revolution. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like there's this part of us that is anticipating confrontation, crisis, meaninglessness, primal fear, fear in the primal body, the oversoul. And we react by, going to esoteric understandings of things. And because so much of what is around us is, magic resembles religion. Magic can, the politics of a hierarchical order, like something like that, can resemble politics. And those things are around us all the time. But when you step into that world, now you're looking at them with almost a different set of eyes. Okay, you're looking at the body politic. You're looking at forms of devotion and working with metaphysics, thinking about metaphysics. It's a much more esoteric, I would say, phenomenologically based thing, where like my experience of these things is what I'm prioritizing, because I'm trying to make sense. I'm trying to find a center of gravity in a world that is kind of spinning out of orbit. And by that, I don't mean the mundane world necessarily so much as I mean the interior world. So I think that we're there now. The only difference is that now, instead of like the printing press, which was throwing gasoline on fire, now we have the internet, and we have, social media and social media platform and video platform virality. That has, really, I think,
well, it's made the esoteric exoteric, right? In a way that people are speaking about it like really openly. And I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that we kind of hit the wall with psychological understandings of what's going on in society. And Absolutely. So people are looking to some deeper explanation, which leads them down the rabbit hole of esotericism, spirituality. And I see even mainstream commentators speaking about the Antichrist, about archons, all this stuff that was really in the occult world for a lot of years. And you would never hear normies speaking of this stuff, but now it's everywhere. You've got Tucker Carlson speaking about, egregores and the Antichrist.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's exotericized it so much as it has commoditized it. It's turned it into a bit of a business. Right. And it doesn't necessarily start with New Age spirituality, but certainly that was one of the first, I think, really outstanding examples, at least within recent memory, of the commoditization of spirituality, and not only that, but like turning it into a buffet. This is very, very syncretic, not even syncretic, I would say, like overly eclectic type of spirituality.
Well, because syncretic would insinuate that you've put it together in something like a coherent model, but now it's just kind of like a mess of potpourri or something.
Exactly.
hasn't been syncretized. It's It's just eclectic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thing. I can tell you, as somebody who has devoted themselves to two paths in particular, there's no way to understand the fullness of esotericism unless you commit to a path and with real teachers. Now, that's not popular because we have an inherent sense of distrust in authority, and we also have a self-aggrandization that has reached cathedral proportions. And not only that, but we in America, in particular, we're so hyper individualist. We tend to miss the point. We tend to shoot ourselves in the foot a lot of times. So you must use discernment and discrimination when you're thinking about joining an esoteric order or something, or stepping in the line of a tradition, the chain of a tradition. But at the same time, you've got to put away your bullshit, because if all this stuff resonated with you, there's no reason for you to be there. You're there to change. You shouldn't understand this stuff. You know what I'm saying? You shouldn't come to like, I got it figured out and I'm just waiting for them to give me the piece of paper that has all the secrets of the universe on it. Okay, that's not what this is. And that's what's happened. It's planted this expectation and this very topical understanding of esoteric concepts in the mainstream mind. But it's still exoteric. Why? Because they don't understand it. They're talking about, they have no understanding.
Right. Yeah, that's what I hear, the podcasts that I've been tuning into that are having these conversations with, different people. And obviously there's a lot of interest and maybe there's some element of audience capture there, like they're just speaking to an audience who's hungry for this information. But every time I hear these guys talking, it is very headline level understanding. They've got all the different buzzwords, but you can tell that nobody's actually engaged in a long-term practice in a particular tradition or lineage to get that true esoteric understanding. And so, I mean, do you think is it just more kind of food for the consumers who are hungry for some kind of explanation about what's going on? Or do you think there's a genuine interest? Like from where you are as someone who teaches courses and is there at the conferences, are there younger people who are actually sincerely interested in initiation, following on a path, committing themselves to a particular path?
Well, there's something that you said at the beginning where people are interested in the ideas.
Mhm.
I would say that people are, and you see this in interpersonal relationships nowadays too. People are interested in the idea of initiation. They're interested in the idea of the occult, the esoteric, ceremonial magic. The same way they're interested in the idea of like, I don't know, a celebrity. But then when you meet that thing and you actually move towards it and you engage with it, well, when the reality shows itself, okay, what this is, then a lot of people they'll nod their heads and smile and kind of quietly check out because it's asking too much and it's designed to do that. Uh,
Mhm.
Now, that's just a consequence. Again, not to dive too much into social commentary, but I'll put it this way: what I find, because I'm also an administrator and a teacher, there's a part of this that I do to obviously support myself, but 50% of this I do completely at like at my own cost because I'm a member of these initiatory orders where I have to initiate people. I have to, along with a whole other bunch of people who are in my position or similar position. Um, but I have to initiate them. I have to coach them through this stuff. I have to listen to their feedback and sort of be a sounding board for their any ideas or experiences they're having. And I have to test them. I have to teach them in terms of actual written tests and practical tests. So what I see from this entire cross section is a factory installed perceptual filter. It's like a pair of contact lenses that you don't know that you're wearing. And a big part of that is the consumerist identity, which is that if I want to do something, I first have to have the stuff. I first have to look like I do it. I first have to get, case in point, all the shitty tattoos that make me look like, what is this? I have Pythagoras on my arm. I'm a mystic. It's like none of that matters. None of that matters, even a tiny bit. As a matter of fact, you're setting yourself back if you want to do this shit for real. Now, it's that classic thing where, and I feel for a lot of people. I truly feel for a lot of people, but particularly in Americans, unfortunately, because I myself am American, even though I was raised in a 50% European household, because my father's not from this country. But you see people that they have an existential burning, a yearning, and they can't get past all of their perceptual bullshit. And so to kind of come full circle on that last point too, they keep approaching the esoteric with their exoteric mind. And then ne'er the twain shall meet. I promise you. You need to divest yourself of so many things before you you become a real practitioner. You need to submit yourself in humility to the process of initiation, which in the Western system is solve et coagula. We're taking you the fuck apart. Okay, we're going to help you take yourself apart. We have guide rails, right? If you've ever gone bowling and put the bumpers down, that's kind of what the Golden Dawn does in its initiatory outer order. And then we're going to help you put yourself back together under the auspices of spirit, right? After having moved through the four elements of your psyche, the
Right.
material, the imaginal, the emotional, and the volitional. But then we're going to tell you, okay, let's do magic.
Right. So rebuild on top of a spiritual foundation rather than egoic foundation.
Right,
Something
and
like that.
an equilibrated foundation, because the ego in the Western system, as opposed to something like, or at least Western interpretations of Eastern systems, which are complete and utter bastardizations in every instance I have personally ever encountered. Be, uh, I would say that there's a difference. A lot of people think that they're going to suffer ego death, and then I'll be free of my ego, and the spirit will come into me, and I'll be peaceful, and I will float up into the stratosphere and dissolve into light. That's not the Western perspective. Ego death is not. I don't have an ego anymore. I don't have the persona anymore. There's no way to fully function in the world. No way to function without an interface. The difference is that is no longer the only thing that exists. And not only that, it's not the thing that is prioritized first in my ontological hierarchy. My spectrum of existence is for most of us, we're like this. We're glued to the persona and its viewpoints. That persona and everything it's been through, all of its baggage, all the good, all the bad, all the shit it's running from. There is a kismet. There is a providential quality to all of the faults and all of the imperfections of your life, because if you manage to reverse what is inherently the state of a human being, that is to say, awaken the soul and put the ego underneath it, instead of to put the soul to sleep and have the ego above it, or the persona is probably a better word here. When you invert that process, the ego becomes extremely useful, because it's the way that the spiritual operates in the material world through you. And that is an alchemy of all your anger, your short-temperedness, your envy, all of that stuff now gets used for good.
Mm-hmm.
You say, well, how could you use envy for good? Well, envy gets transmutated into something like, extreme self-motivation, or something like, okay, compassion. I feel the envy in me, and I'm gonna stuff it down, or not stuff it down, but understand that it can't take over, and then start to put myself in the other person's shoes. And then it's like, you don't sit there and do nothing. You go and you go forth into the world that way. And
Yeah.
it
Well,
is
just
a
to pause there
nuanced.
for a second. Yeah. Like envy, if you get behind the envy, you're going to find out what you really desire.
Exactly.
Right. And then how can I use my will to meet that desire, to attain that thing I desire? Yeah. Rather than just get stuck in the envy and that kind of reactive oppositional state.
Yes. Yeah. And what's worse is unaddressed envy. Envy in you that, like, you feel and you're seething, and it's kind of like a background program. It's like running in the background, and you never bring it to the front and look at it and address it. So it stays with you for days, sometimes weeks, maybe even months, maybe even years. And so the outer order of something like the Golden Dawn and other initiatory systems of the West forces you to look directly in the face of the things that you are projecting into what we call your magical mirror of the universe.
That's interesting. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the Golden Dawn, but what you're describing sounds a lot like what Carl Jung talked about as the relativization of the ego. You don't dissolve the ego, the persona. We need it. It's a part of our character.
Mhm.
If you follow Plato and the myth of Ur, it comes with us. That
Yeah.
that character is ingrained in us, but you relativize it. Yeah.
Yeah.
My yoga guru would always say, you make the heart the boss.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and it's a good point. In that you bring up the myth of Ur. You know, I would say my specialty is Platonism, and because it is the foundation of all Western esotericism and the traditions that extend from it, in particular, like Neoplatonism, and Platonic sort of theurgic Neoplatonism. Um, there's a tremendous thing there where, right, the word in Greek for soul is psyche. Okay, that's the etymological root of our word psychology. And I was initially accused by of course, the peanut gallery, that okay, well, this guy's throwing around the term soul, but it's not well defined. Okay, let's define exactly what the ancients thought the soul to be. This the aggregate totality of your experience of interiority. There's a lot of fancy words. It's everything that happens in here. Your thoughts, your emotions, your habits, all of that is your soul. Okay, they just thought it continued on. Now, what's the real major consequence of that? Well, and this was the telos, the purpose of the Platonic paideia, right? The education of the soul. It's because you don't just die and all of a sudden, if you've been a good person or you've been a bad person, you float up to heaven or you go
Right.
down
And all that
to
stuff
hell.
gets erased.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. What
Like you clear
happened?
the hard drive. No.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's actually the reverse. Materiality has, or material embodiment, existence itself has, and it makes perfect sense once you say it and clarify it, but it has a consequence to the soul in that it conditions it. And these conditions take the form of things like envy, things like intense desire, not being able to control our appetites within the boundary points of what we know in our highest part of ourself, our rational soul, as Plato would call it, is not good for us.
Right.
And we can't keep ourselves in those confines of what is highest and best. And Plato minces no words about it. He says, everybody knows in here. Everybody knows what the right thing to do is. It's just you will equivocate and you'll use all this kind of like gray language to talk about like, well, we don't know. And he gives us a set of tools, right? Particularly the four cardinal virtues and the dialectic. But what he's trying to tell us is that the way you live your life is going to condition your soul. Would a soul that has spent its entire existence caring for itself and the body and stuffing itself and gratifying every desire, would it even want to go to a realm where there is no way to appease or gratify or express these desires, these intense appetites
Yeah.
that the soul now has?
Carnal desires. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a good point that you bring up the myth of Ur. It's a foundational document for esotericism.
I think it's such a helpful story for us Westerners in terms of like, kind of an alternate story that was there before Christianity about where we come from, who we are, where we're headed, and with some guidance around how to live this life.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, Plato is very much inspired by pre-Socratic Hellenic interpretations of ultimately Egyptian wisdom. And I would say Mesopotamian. Pythagoras himself, if you look on a map, he was from Samos. Samos is much closer to the Near East than it is to mainland Greece. And he's also said to have worn pants. And a lot of people would be like, who cares? That's kind of silly. It's like Greeks did not wear pants. It would have been absurd. It would have been like somebody wearing their shirt on their legs and their pants on their head in modern society. What are you doing? They wore tunics and they wore these things called hymations, but they let the breeze flow down there. The reason why pants were literally invented was for people who rode on horseback. Greeks did not ride on horseback. The horseback riders were from Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey. And so a lot of the Pythagorean wisdom actually obviously he said in his biography, in his biographies, his later biographers mentioned that he studied in Egypt for a very long period of time. But it's also very clear that some of the wisdom that he imparted to the Greeks and to the Mediterranean, as a matter of fact, Mediterranean Europe, what was from Mesopotamia. But it's I'm waiting very patiently. This is where I think scholars have a great relationship to practical occultism and this kind of stuff. Scholars have, when we can understand the archaeological evidence, the textual evidence of ancient Babylonia, ancient Sumer, we don't. Not a lot of this stuff is translated. Part of that is because of the political situation. Like you can't just go into the interior of Iran, right, and start digging and taking their texts to translate. But I think that it's an underserved part of the study of Western history.
It's as part of my sociological study of what's going on with the Gen Zers. I ran across this guy who was on a podcast, and I guess it seems like he's a young guy who's following in the footsteps of Graham Hancock and the whole ancient archaeology, kind of comparative esotericism kind of thing, finding the symbols that show up in all the different places. And so he gave this presentation on things that he's found, all these commonalities from disparate places. And his big conclusion was that he felt that the ancients were communicating the kind of the source code of reality. And the big revelation for him was, I believe the religion of the future will be Hermeticism. I thought, interesting.
Yeah. The thing about Hermeticism too is that a lot of people, even scholars, don't necessarily agree with this, but I think it becomes abundantly clear when you actually dive into both of the textual corpora, meaning the body of work of both traditions. There are no Hermetic documents that predate the Platonic dialogues. And a lot of people will automatically locate the Hermetica within the more unique purview of ancient Egyptian wisdom as a tradition. I'm not denying that, but certainly it's expressed in a Greek idiom. It's written in Greek and it's written in Coptic, which is out of, I think, the 36 letters, I think 24 are Greek. And they're using Greek words. They're not using Egyptian words when they are writing in Coptic. And a lot of these words come directly from the Platonic tradition and the way that they operate together. Now, as I mentioned before, Plato was ultimately transmitting something that came from Egypt and Babylonia, but the Hermetica is really important because it is the synthesis of Greek and Egyptian thought, philosophy, sort of distilled into a philosophical canon that mostly agrees with itself. So really so before, I think the 6th century, you call that Hermetism, right? When it's rediscovered, or at least brought back to the West in the very beginnings of the Renaissance, 15th century, and Marsilio Ficino, via the Medici dynasty, he translates all this stuff. Then it becomes Hermeticism. And really the main Hermeticist is Ludovico Lazzarelli. He doesn't get enough credit. He actually was much more of a Hermeticist than Ficino. Ficino's more of a Platonist, and Ficino did not translate the entire Corpus Hermeticum. Lazzarelli did. But Lazzarelli's famous for saying, I am a Hermeticist and a Christian. Because he saw fundamentally no difference, no incompatibility between the two. And what this all boils down to put a bow on it, is this idea that there is a prisca theologia, or a pristine theology, or a perennial philosophy. This is very New Agey. It's very wishy-washy, fluffy kind of stuff. But being in the milieu of practice that I have been in for over 20 years, think I'm coming up on 25 years soon, in just a couple of weeks. And, you know, studying this stuff and teaching it at a very high level in terms of scholarship. I talk to these people are my friends. A lot of these scholars, you know, I'm very much so consider them colleagues and friends. Wouter Hanegraaff, Greg Shaw, Shannon Grimes, Aaron Cheek, great scholars. You know, having a foot in both worlds, there's something there is like a thread that runs through everything, and it's all saying the same thing. It's telling the story of the soul. I think Hermeticism is a good candidate for how we go forward, but we must remember this. You can't go backwards. There is no going back to Hermeticism. Why? Because those people didn't exist in a world with TikTok and AI. And it's like the best we can do, right? Because that's the main problem most people have. 99% of people have is that we're so far abstracted from their human experience, right? It's not Game of Thrones where like we're painting history with the brush of our own persona, our own characteristics. These people were very different than we are. We've been abstracted from the human experience for the most part. We've been taken out of what it means to be on a day-to-day basis a human being for the past, several millennia. We don't do any of that stuff anymore. So there's no way for us to go back, but we can take some of the fundamental components of Hermetism, the ancient Hermetic tradition, and we can bring it to use in the modern time. But what you need is somebody who understands the text first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I've been kind of tuning into Ammon Hillman lately, reading his book, Chemical Muse, and a couple of his later books, which get kind of increasingly bizarre and polemic. But it's been interesting over the past few years. He's garnered quite a kind of a cult following. But the thing that he's always saying is, first and foremost, he's a Greek philologist. And his biggest complaint with biblical scholars, theologians, esoteric scholars, is a lot of them don't really go to the source text. They can't read the ancient Greek. They can't contextualize it in the broader range of texts. And I think there is something to that, because what is revealed is, I think one of the things that it does is just show how different people were back, in 1st to 5th century AD, etc., from who we are now. So definitely, like, there's no going back. You can't go and recreate, the rituals and spells in the PGM and get away with it for too long. But I'm wondering, like, for you as a practitioner, someone who teaches, what are some of the core elements that we can put to good use in this day and age, and what would the goal actually be?
Well, I talk a lot about theurgy. Okay, theurgia in Greek. By the way, I do read the Greek because I'm ethnically Greek, so I speak the language. Granted, it's ancient Greek, but I have a really strong handle on a lot of that stuff. So I talk about theurgia, right, which is people translate it as God working, which isn't incorrect, but really it's probably better translated as divine action. And this is effectively the techniques and technologies of magic, right? Specifically applied to not getting yourself stuff, not getting yourself a wife, not, making yourself whatever. Specifically to the purification, elevation, and illumination of the individual soul. And by purification, what I mean is the removal of the obstructions to your awakening, your gnosis, what we would call in the Platonic tradition, anamnesis, your remembering of your divinity, not intellectually, not theoretically, oh yes, God is inside of me. No, it's an experience that transcends words. Okay, it's like going lucid in a dream. It's an experience. And if you're this person who likes to say, well, we're all one and God is within me, but you have not had that experience, what you're doing is self-deification, which is effectively nihilism, solipsism. Theurgy is using the techniques and technologies of what we call magic, specifically to those purposes of communion with the divine and the elevation of the soul. Now, again, so that I'm not accused of being imprecise, magic, my definition of it is the product of the interaction between my conscious experience, your conscious experience, and what we call metaphysical causality. So physical causality is I line up 7 dominoes and boop, 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 boop. They all until the last one falls. And you can see that. That's physical causality. We can trace it. It makes sense. There's a logic to it. Metaphysical causality is that you got a domino here and a domino here. And there's a gap between them. And you hit this one, and that one falls. We don't know why. Our best theories defy our understanding of why that happens, but we're using this phenomenon and the centuries and millennia of techniques that have been developed and what we can understand about what works and our theories as to why, and we're applying that specifically in this direction. So then, Pete, the next obvious question is, why do I need to do that? Mm-hmm. Like, what are you telling me? Like the ancient stuff is basically like a pagan Christianity where we need to be saved? Precisely. Actually, the idea of soteriology comes from these traditions, the Platonic tradition, the Hermetic tradition, the Neo-Platonic tradition. And to really understand what they're saying, you need to understand the story of the soul as they are telling it. And it's from that. Because we've had peace, love, justice fed to us, to the nth degree from all sorts of textual sources. That doesn't mean anything at the end of the day because we can't do it. It's not working. It's because we're fundamentally, we won't look at this idea that the soul is entombed in matter. Okay, that's from Platonism. That's from Orphism. Orphism, as the great scholar Algisius Divinis actually took this from the Egyptian tradition. Okay, it goes all the way through this story of the soul. We find it encoded in myths like the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, right? Orpheus, his soul, his anima. The soul is always spoken of as a feminine, virginal. Okay, Eurydice is his new bride. They have not consummated their relationship yet. She's bitten on the heel by a snake and goes into the underworld, and his job is to go down and get her. But he fails. He fails in the underworld, and so she needs to go back down. Where do we see that? Persephone and Hades. She bends down, according to the Homeric hymn, to pick the narcissus flower. And what happens? Hades comes up from the underworld, grabs her down. They send a rescue mission via Hermes, but she's eaten a seed, so she needs to come back down. It's in all the Psyche and Eros, all of these myths. It's reincarnation, or what the Greeks in the Platonic tradition called metempsychosis, the transmigration of the soul. And we need to understand what the mechanism of that is. And we've been talking about it this entire time, that the soul becomes conditioned by desires, gratifying desires, unchecked in this realm. And so that we continue to come back down into this wash dry cycle of where the soul is completely disoriented and latent, and the persona with its greedy needs is leading the charge the entire time. This is effectively what Platonism, Orphism, ancient Egyptian pyramid texts, the Hermetic tradition, Gnosticism, and early Christianity. Christianity, without that, Christianity can't exist. It can never exist. If there isn't a pre-existing, yes, this is the story of the soul. And they knew that back then. We don't know that because we don't want to look at that because it's religious, and that means it's very world denying. It doesn't have to be world denying, because once the soul wakes up, hell, Hades, the underworld, becomes Eden, becomes a paradise. You've just got to be willing to acknowledge the fact that this is what it is, and you will not find any other iteration of this at the core of any of these ancient philosophies. This is it.
Yeah, it seems to me the foundation of a classical education was this fundamental story about who we are, why we're here, and what we should be doing with our life. And I think, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about is that we lack that meta narrative.
Yeah.
And so people are scrambling for different explanations for, you know, how we got here, what we're doing here, where we're going, all of that, how we should live. And there's something about returning to these old stories that gives us, I think, a sense of roots from which we can flourish, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, personally believe they were meant to do that. They were meant I don't know if you want to think of like a sci-fi kind of context. It's like, okay, I'm recording this message for people in the future.
Hmm.
But the thing is, it's like, what if this message is from so far in the past that I don't understand the language? It's the
Hmm.
same thing with mythology. Okay, it's not people, poo-pooed Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. Carl Jung, by the way, in his library, which is still extant, I believe in Vienna or maybe Switzerland, somewhere. I
Yeah.
forget where
No,
exactly it is.
it's in Switzerland at the family home there. Yeah.
Exactly, his library. He's got the Holy Kabbalah by Arthur Edward Waite, a member of the Golden Dawn, with all of his marginalia. Jung was reading the Golden Dawn stuff. He was reading those writers. We don't want to talk about it, but because it's embarrassing to the Jungians.
Mm.
But because like they come from that generation where all stuff is, we don't, it rubs us the wrong way. It rubs against our
It's
Christian.
okay if it's all symbolic or
Right.
psychologized, but to put it into practice, then you're kind of, I don't know, you're not a
Yeah,
very trustworthy person.
exactly.
And yeah, I think that part of who Jung was, the practitioner, the esotericist, the magician,
Yes.
I think that really gets downplayed,
Yeah. I mean, but they're even
unfortunately,
they're
you know.
they're even willing to admit, but they're just saying like, oh, it was kind of this thing he did on the side. But they're willing to admit to the fact that he casts astrological charts for his patients. Like, he
Yeah.
was reading their astrology, so and these are indisputable facts. It's just that for people that are not in these communities, it's easy to not know. It's gate kept.
Well, you could easily look at his process of active imagination as a type of theurgy.
His process of imagination is exactly what active imagination is exactly what Iamblichus describes in On the Mysteries, and De Anima in particular, On the Soul, who the great John Finnemore translated wonderfully. Iamblichus says, when you have communion with the divine, they don't take over your conscious mind at first, okay? Or it's not like a possession necessarily. That can happen, but it's a divine madness that you undergo. But when you begin to finally sort of increase what they called your epididiotis, meaning your receptivity, your capacity
Hmm.
to come within proximity or really receive the divine, they don't seize your mind and attention. They seize what he calls the fantasia, the imagination, the imaginal faculty, and that becomes animated and is raised above, elevated above by the divine, what is ordinarily human. Those are his words, right? Somebody writing around 1800 years ago. For anybody that's done magic, has done any scrying, has done path workings, and you just have this moment that is so existentially jarring where in the eye of your mind you see a figure and it has its own complete autonomy to the extent where you cannot anticipate what it is going to do or say, and all you can think to yourself is, I am not thinking this. How is this possible?
Mm.
And that's what Iamblichus is describing 1800 years ago. The mind and attention follow what happens. That's what he says. That's you being the observer, because they are not seized by the divine. But the fantasia, the imaginal, that is seized by the divine and raised above what is ordinarily human.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, active imagination was Jung's take on that.
Yeah. I think like um, I think the name does it a kind of a disservice because the way that we interpret that as modern Westerners is imagination is something that I do, that I think up. And active is means I'm actively doing that. I thought, in retrospect, it would have much better been called something like interactive imagining, something like that, that speaks to the autonomy of the image. And this is something I wanted to ask you about when working with imagination. So I've often taught people shamanic journeying, using a drum to get people into a light trance state.
Awesome.
And one of the things that always comes up with people is that feeling like I felt like I really had to make things happen. And I said, that's the beginning step, is
Yeah.
you might have to kind of seed the imaginal to kind of like get things working. But then at a certain point, if you stick with it, something else takes over. And then you're no longer the
Absolutely.
one driving the experience. You're kind of finding yourself being driven by the experience. Now, you're nodding, so would you agree that certainly like a step that you have to get through is that feeling of I've got to really work to kind of generate these images or this scenario?
Yes, absolutely. What you've described is something that I've experienced and I see time and time again teaching people to do this stuff. It is difficult for people. I'll put it this way. Esoteric orders develop so that they can teach people at the very beginning what we call symbolic vocabularies. Okay, so the signs of the zodiac, the signs of the elements, alchemical sigils, the planets in the zodiac. You take all these and you memorize them. What's so esoteric about that? Well, what you don't understand is that this is being assimilated into your psyche and becoming a reliable symbolic vocabulary. Whereas most people, when they would go into trance or when they have to generate these images, they're just drawing from their available imagery. Which I mean, it could be Ren and Stimpy, it could be it could be Big Bird. It's like so
No,
so.
that's such a great point, and I think speaks to what, why I personally think it's so important to read children fairy tales and myths because it does seed that symbolic vocabulary from the
Absolutely.
from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, you're available, and this is like you say, this is the entry step, the entryway. Okay, but a lot of people stop there and they think they've reached revelation. When you begin to interact with your subconscious and that available imagery, the stuff that just pops up there, you don't know why, but it's familiar to you. That is, those symbols are personal.
Hmm.
Okay, so now you're going through your personal subconscious. Where we want to get is the collective unconscious, which is the realm of what we call archetypes. Okay, now that our personal subconscious leads us to it's got a little hallway that will eventually get us there. But a lot of people stop in the personal subconscious and they think that they can psychologize away their problems by understanding it. I can't tell you not only
Yeah.
how many times I have personally been guilty of this, but how many other people I see. Just because you know like what's going on in here, you could still be a piece of shit. You could still be a bad person.
Yeah.
Like, not, it's not enough to know, as we say in Latin,
Yeah.
non sati
The
sciti.
the well analyzed asshole.
Exactly. So you don't want to
They
stop
can tell
there.
you all about themselves,
Yeah.
all the way down to the so-called unconscious of the shadow,
Yeah.
and wear it like a badge that they've been there and done that work.
Yeah. But the
Yeah, it's
thing is,
interesting. I get what you're saying there, that the images from the personal unconscious, I think, speak to that kind of the impressions in our own individual soul, like which ones kind of adhere to us or draw
Mhm.
us in. They do tell us a lot about who we are fundamentally. And I think, like what you said, they lead us down a hallway, I think, to maybe a particular alcove of the collective unconscious where we'll encounter a whole bunch of images that don't come from our childhood stories or our family religion or anything like that. And that's where it gets really fucking interesting and where the reality of the past life of reincarnation becomes so obvious and apparent there's no way to explain it away. I mean, it's the only explanation that makes sense to me.
yeah, yeah, and that's and that is the fundamental difference is that the available imagery is but as I said, personal, individual, whereas the imagery that we need to get to as magicians ultimately is universal. And so we need to be able to understand the universals. As you put, things get weird over there, and this is when people start to have religious experience sometimes. This is when people start to, they have visions. But again, there's no guarantee that your psyche is going to be able to filter that stuff in any way that is intelligible to you. So the purpose of learning universal symbols, right? There's only one Sagittarius. There's not a different Sagittarius. There's only one Mars. There's not a different Mars. These are universal potencies, universal qualities that have all these correspondences associated with them. Mars, for instance, energy, activity, courage, boundaries, competition, combat. Okay, you've got all that stuff, and it's signified in a symbol. All of that stuff is packed into a symbol. So when you inculcate, you learn all of that stuff, the Hebrew alphabet, the Greek alphabet, these become symbols too. Because why? Because they're scriptural languages. And so, that helps us interpret those images that come from really without.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about me is, I come from a blue collar background. I'm a very kind of practical person. So I started with practice, primarily yoga, going deep into that practice and study, and plant medicine, shamanism. I got into all of this scholarship coming out of those experiences because I was encountering images, symbols, intuitions, feelings, whatever, and then trying to make sense of them, trying to put them into a context. So that turned me into a kind of esoteric historian. And I'm still on that journey because it's just infinitely deep. And I mean, currently I'm deep into ancient Greece, and I've started to learn ancient Greek. And I tell my wife about this, but there's something like so incredibly magical about learning the alphabet and being able to go to an original text and letter by letter sound out the word and have a deity revealed to me. To see finally that word that is the form of Hermes or whoever. I mean, I haven't been this excited about something like in so long. Like it's like a mystery is being unveiled through the language. And what I suspect, like when I was studying Sanskrit and doing a lot of Vedic chanting, is I suspect that when I go deeper into the Greek language, that it is going to change my consciousness. I just know that.
Absolutely. So many things, so in so many different ways. First of all, the syntax is way different, as you probably know. Somebody would say, hey, do you want to go to the store with me today? And then you'd say in a different syntax, particularly in Greek, today, would you go to the store, with me, or with me today? Would you go store? That kind of stuff. There's not all these connective words necessarily in Greek. That's why they call
That
this
comes
stuff.
later in modern Greek. That's why modern Greek looks so different from ancient Greek.
Exactly. And it's also, that's part of the idea of these things being Romance languages at their core, is that there's a wordplay, there's a poetry about them, that they're not as syntactically kind of structured, in the way that Anglophone, right? So basically Germanic languages are, which is, English
Yeah, so practical and useful and functional. Really hard to squeeze poetry out of, though.
Yeah. You got to be good, but it's that alone will orient you to the fact that, okay, in order for a modern person to be able to read this, the translator had to take a bunch of liberties, because they had to put this together in a way. And so then that's why you can, if you follow the Stephanos numbers on something like the Platonic Dialogues, right? And that they're there so that no matter what translation you're reading, you can cite these lines. I know where I am in the text, because You can read the Jowett, you can read the Cooper, you can read all sorts of different translations of Plato, and they sometimes say almost completely different things.
Dude, I was in the bookstore yesterday with 5 different copies of Odyssey, trying to figure out which translation am I gonna get, man.
Yeah. I liked Fagles. I thought he did a good job.
That's funny. I ended up with Fagles.
Yeah, Fagles did a really good job.
Because Ted Hughes had a blurb in the back. It said, rough is like appropriately rough but beautiful, something like that. And I'm like, okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you have to remember that. I mean, like they were a rough culture too, but they had epic poetry. Yeah, I mean, there's another component though to sort of learning these languages, I think. Part of me, the magician here, the person who worked in those circles or still works in those circles, but has been in it for a long time, I would be inclined to say like you might have some sort of like past thing going on with ancient Greece or some sort of Hellenic thing happening there.
Oh, you know what? I mean, I just logged back into 23andMe after a couple of years of not paying any attention, and just because I was like, yeah, I remember most of it. Let me go back in, check it out. And 1% Coptic.
Yeah, there you go.
What the hell?
That's awesome. That's awesome, man. Coptic is wild, and I didn't, the whole thing is like as an ethno group, it's even interesting because it's like the Copts were just the Egyptian
so
Christian.
Weird. Yeah. Yeah, but kind of Greek speaking Egyptian Christians. I mean,
yeah, 100%. But yeah, I mean that language in and of itself will fundamentally rewire you in even more, I would say numinous ways, more spiritual ways, more metaphysical ways. But yeah.
Well, it was like, I mean, one of the, me getting into yoga so deeply and having this affinity to chanting Sanskrit. I'd be doing workshops in California and there'd be Indian people who show up. And they would always remark, man, your Sanskrit is better than mine.
Yeah.
But there was just something like obviously there was a deep soul resonance with this practice and with this language, which was just one of the things that affirmed for me reincarnation. I mean, there's no belief there. It's just for me, it's like, it just makes sense. It's the only way to make sense of my experience.
Yeah. And we have practices. We have in the Golden Dawn that you go through for that kind of self-examination. There's practices that you use. I wouldn't advise them to like just anyone because it's effectively, you've probably done it if not at least heard of it, but regression techniques and basically going into stored memory beyond this lifetime. And what you find is that it sounds really cool until you experience your death in another life. And then people walk out of there completely traumatized. And I don't ever want to do that again, with like now a lifetime to unpack what they saw about.
Right. Now, not just the trauma of this life, but now the trauma of the past life too.
Exactly.
The burden just doubled.
Yeah, exactly.
But you've got a cool story for all your New Age friends, right?
Yeah, you can prove that something happened.
I was a soldier in the Trojan War.
Yeah, yeah, I was Aleister Crowley in another life.
To watch or listen to the full episode, become a free or paid member by visiting patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness, or by downloading the Patreon app to your mobile device. Paid memberships start at just $5 a month and offer a number of benefits, including early access to all episodes, the full podcast archives, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting an independent creator directly. Thanks.